Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to our Insights session, UK Agriculture and the Net Zero Challenge. I'm Darragh Cotter, a Senior Market Advisor with Enterprise Ireland in our London office. To those who might be unfamiliar, Enterprise Ireland is a trade and innovation agency of the Irish Government, and we work with over 5,000 Irish SMEs to help them start, grow, innovate and export globally. One of our key remits is the sharing of relevant market insights with the Irish SME base to enable them to adapt their business strategies and R&D efforts accordingly. Today's session forms part of Enterprise Ireland's newly launched Net Zero UK campaign. Our Net Zero UK campaign has been designed to ensure that Irish SMEs, particularly those with a strong presence in the UK market, are fully informed of the major policy, market and sectoral developments that are driving environmental and sustainability changes. As part of the campaign, today we take a closer look at the role of the UK agricultural sector in helping to deliver the net zero transition and what this means for Irish SMEs working across the supply chain in the UK. It's also worth noting that this week we have also had sessions taking a closer look at the UK construction, local authorities and energy sectors. Please do get in touch if you want any more details on any of these. In a moment, I'll hand you over to Michael Haverty of the Anderson Centre, who will provide us with a comprehensive briefing. If you have any questions for Michael during his presentation, you can submit these via the questions tab or the chat tab on the sidebar of GoToWebinar, and I'll do my best to relay these to Michael during our Q&A discussion at the end. For now, Michael, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Darragh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and very welcome to today's session on Net Zero Challenge in UK Agriculture. Just going to leave my webcam up just very briefly so you can put a face to my name. I work with the Anderson Centre. We're a farm business consultancy based in Leicestershire. We've colleagues each day advising farmers, about 2,000 farmers per annum, on all aspects of agriculture. And then I sit on the research team, and our focus is very much key macroeconomic issues facing UK farming. And in that context, of course, one of the major challenges that we are seeing very much becoming front and center now in UK agriculture is the net zero challenge. So in that context, and just first of all, in terms of webinar admin, you'll see there's a little control panel on your screens. If you click that red arrow, it opens and closes the control panel. When you open the control panel, there is a facility to ask questions, as you will see on your screen further on down. If you just simply type in your question there, we will, as part of the panel, endeavour to answer those, particularly at the end of the presentation. And there will also be a copy of the slides available today in the handouts section. If you've not already received those, they will be forwarded onto you. And just to point out, in terms of today's presentation, there will be some additional bonus slides that will be in the handouts that I won't necessarily speak to today, just in the context of time, but they are there as additional background information for you. So in terms of today's agenda, which should be coming up on your screen now, just provide some background context into the whole net zero challenge and how the UK has been performing in that context. We'll then turn our attention to policy. A lot of change taking place within the UK, of course, not just agriculture policy, environment policy as well, also of relevance and certainly will be drivers of the net zero agenda. Then we will take some time just to focus on the whole issue of carbon markets and offsetting, because again, that is an issue that farming is increasingly becoming aware of and important to bear in mind within the broader net zero context. We'll then turn our attention to some of the food industry initiatives and what all of that means at farm level in terms of net zero and the experience that Anderson's as consultants are seeing. And then we'll turn our attention to, well, what does all of this mean for Irish SME exporters into the UK market? Where are some of the key opportunities? What are some of the key issues that need to be considered? And at the end, after our conclusions, we would open up the discussion for questions and answers at that point in time. So in terms of an overview and where we are at the moment, I think it's important just to bear in mind the carbon budgets that the UK has in process at the moment. And you can see on your screens there the black line just denoting UK's historical emissions, and the light blue bars denoting the initial phases of carbon budgets over recent years and the ones that have been planned into the future. And you can see at the moment the UK is actually on target in terms of its overall carbon budgets. However, we would very much point out that the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, has been focused on the things that are easy to do in terms of reducing emissions, particularly around electricity generation, for instance. As we move into the future, and particularly as you can see with the new proposed sixth carbon budget that will take place in the 2030s, it will become more and more difficult to reduce carbon. Those easy to do things will no longer be available, and that in turn has influenced the projection denoted by that grey dashed line in the years ahead in terms of the emissions that the UK is projected to have. So whilst the UK might just about reach its forthcoming series of carbon budget targets, as we move into the future, there is likely to be a gap emerging based on current policies. So more is needed basically in terms of what all industries can do to meet that net zero challenge. So a couple of additional slides in your packs, which I'm not going to speak to today, just looking at agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions overall in the UK. It's around about 10% of total emissions. Have been some decreases since 1990 as well, but certainly a lot more work to be done. Here, we're just focusing on the contribution of various greenhouse gases to UK agriculture's overall emissions. We're going back to the 1990s, very much that is the benchmark against which targets are set. And you can see the contribution of each sector as we move through the years onwards into itself is a relatively small contribution to that. And you can see in addition to that, it's more methane, nitrous oxide in particular, which are the key issues that UK farming and agriculture faces, particularly in terms of methane from a livestock perspective. So if we're going to move towards net zero by 2040, then there are some key issues that will need to be considered, and particularly how the land use and forestry is going to help meet that overall net zero challenge. And you can see by the black line denoted on your screen the net emissions that are projected within the UK, particularly as we move towards 2040. A big increase would be expected from land use and forestry in order to meet that. And I suppose one other point we would make, this is net zero across agriculture as a whole. There are going to be some sectors in our view that will still need to have some net emissions taking place. It's not going to be every individual sector we feel that is going to be achieving net zero within its own right. Some sectors will be net emitters, some sectors will be net sequesters of CO2, particularly in terms of the forestry sector. So if we move on then just to look at some of the net zero commitments from an overall international policy perspective, of course the Paris Agreement very much dominates this, and strong commitments there in terms of reducing emissions versus 1990 levels. It has recently been increased to a 75 or 78% drop by 2035. So moving towards that net zero target that the UK government has set by 2050, that is definitely a challenge. Interestingly, the NFU are promoting agriculture net zero by 2040, and here carbon capture is going to be a vital part of that. So as you can see, the overall commitments, the targets are strong targets, ambitious targets, and certainly sets a challenge for the UK agricultural sector to meet those emissions. Some achievements, 56% reduction in emissions against 1990, but as I said, they are the easier things that have been done. It now becomes much harder to achieve marginal gains in the overall amount of CO2 that can be taken out of the atmosphere to achieve net zero as we move into the future. So from a more legislative, UK legislative perspective, I suppose a couple of key areas we need to consider within all of this. And certainly agricultural policy is an important part. Now that the UK has left the EU and agricultural policy is a devolved competence, each of the UK nations will be setting their own farm policy. England is the most progressed in this context at the moment. Its transition is already underway, moving away from the BPS to the public money for public goods, the environmental land management schemes. So we will touch upon that in some more detail during the presentation today. Certainly, environment is a core focus, and net zero within that context is particularly important. If we look at Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they're not as far on in that process. Wales is on a similar type trajectory to England in the future, albeit the transition is more delayed, but certainly focus on a long-term sustainable farming. Within Scotland, minimal appetite for change at present. It's wanting to stay for political reasons as close to the EU as possible, but one can see an altered approach emerging, particularly around climate change, and that is likely to gain more focus in the future. And within Northern Ireland, the executive been not sitting for 3 years, that has had an impact on a range of different policies, and their agriculture policy is being formulated as we speak. But once again, we can see, based on what DAERA has shared, environmental sustainability, in addition to greenhouse gases, ammonia being particularly important. It certainly is a core focus overall. And in terms of legislation that has been released by UK Parliament, the Agriculture Act is certainly important here. It gives that overarching framework for UK agricultural policy, and then goes into detail in terms of mainly covering England with the rollout of the environmental land management, and also providing legal support in Scotland as well, or legal basis for future agricultural reform. So within England, within the Agricultural Act, we can see the rollout of the environmental land management schemes are starting now. There's a pilot of the sustainable farming incentive underway at the moment as well, and certainly not just greenhouse gas emissions, but environmental emissions more generally is a key aspect of that. And there is more of a focus as well on other key areas such as fertilizer usage, how data can be utilised, and the overall performance of the food chain, and what can be done to move all supply chains towards a net zero position. Agriculture, though, is not the only area. Do need to pay attention to the Environment Bill as well, which is returning to Parliament now after a long pause. This has come in the aftermath of the 25-year Environment Plan that was released by the UK government a few years back. Very much more an aspirational statement of intentions as opposed to a plan itself, but it is providing the overall framework for the Environment Bill. Here, a few key things to point out. Office for Environmental Protection being set up now that the UK is outside of the EU, and there is more of a focus on key aspects of farming in terms of inputs usage for fertilizers and sprays, also any waste and water usage as well becoming important. And the whole concept of a net biodiversity gain within the whole planning laws, if a development takes place, any nature or biodiversity removed from that development, there needs to be a net gain put in elsewhere, and that can certainly have an influence on farming in the future and may create opportunities for some to provide more of that biodiversity or public goods. So again, an area of focus. Ammonia emissions, particularly important in certain parts of the UK. getting a lot of attention within Northern Ireland as well. And this includes a whole new area of rules around slurry spreading, slurry management, for instance. And that again can create opportunities for those providing products and services in that area. So that then moves us on to the whole area of carbon markets. And I think important just to pay attention to that, if being as a supplier into the UK farming sector, what is taking place there at the moment and how that could potentially influence opportunities in the future. And this carbon markets term, it's very much a generic term to look at all market or financial based instruments to reduce emissions overall. And of course, within the EU and now the UK has its own separate emissions trading scheme as well. Agriculture, though, not included within that, and that looks set to be the trend or the situation in the near future at least. So in terms of carbon and how to address the overall carbon challenge, certainly a lot of weight at the moment just looking at carbon tax, seen as an economically elegant way of pricing in emissions. You tax it at the point that it enters the economy, so that also includes carbon taxes on imports, and we've seen a lot of focus within the EU on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But no real sign of introduction at the moment within the UK. I think there are also complexities there that need to be considered. How do you levy it? How do you compare one product against another? So a number of different challenges to be overcome. And therefore, one area that's really getting focused on is the whole area of carbon offsets. And these are things that businesses and individuals increasingly choose to do to address any carbon footprints that they might have, either from business operations or from private consumption, taking flights, for instance. And within that context, I've mentioned biodiversity offsets before. Again, important to think of these as well here, creating habitats to replace those lost to development. And a 10% net gain overall is being targeted in England. Here, there would be the need to enter into longer term management agreements to provide those conservation covenants, so to speak. Tree planting, once again, being considered as a key aspect of that, but not the only measure that can be included. So in terms of offsetting then, just to look at that in some more detail, there's really three key issues that the farming industry needs to look at if it is going to go down this route. And the first of those is just permanence in terms of offsetting any reduction in carbon. It needs to be long term. Yes, arable farms in particular can do annual activities. Cover cropping, for instance, gets mentioned. But some of those activities in terms of yearly rotations and cropping cycles, those carbon savings can easily be reversed from one year into the next. So a more permanent type of solution, and particularly here, tree planting often gets mentioned. Also, the concept of additionality is important. Any of these offsetting schemes, it's focusing on farmers doing something extra. So existing hedgerows, for instance, fallow land, even woodland on farm that's there existing at the moment, there tends to be no payment for that. There needs to be something extra that is done. And another key challenge within the sector overall is just the overall measurement. And we see particular challenges on this in an agricultural context. There's about 64 different carbon calculators out there at the moment, and they're all having somewhat different methodologies, and in some cases delivering a wide range of different results. So certainly there is a challenge, I think, to come up with a globally robust method for measuring carbon, and the COP26 conference in Glasgow, I think that needs to be an opportunity to address that particular issue. And all the while, in terms of offsetting, this needs to be done cheaply if possible and regularly so that it can be in terms of the amount of carbon that is being sequestered. So as I've alluded to, woodland certainly leading the way on this. It's seen as a good way to address some of the issues, viewed as a permanent land use change, and it certainly is an addition to what has been done previously. It also helps to address some of the key measurement and management issues as well. It's relatively easy to quantify, what a tree or a hectare of trees is sequestering in terms of carbon. The targets that the UK has set here, quite ambitious, I think around about 30,000 hectares per year during this decade. If we look at where the UK is at the moment, it is round about half of that at the minute. So certainly a big increase required there, and Scotland is seen as an area that would be particularly important in that context. Also worth mentioning in the context of net zero, the whole area of regenerative agriculture. Some rather skeptically might view this as mixed farming via another name, but here focus is very much on improving the overall organic matter in the soil health more generally, and this of course will also have an impact on carbon and the amount of CO2 that can be sequestered. Number of different benefits that are seen within this area, and certainly biodiversity, soil erosion, which is a particular problem in certain parts of the UK, particularly over in the Finland areas, and it can also help in terms of input use, particularly nitrogen fertilizer, which in turn again can have a big impact on emissions. And here, soil being a key aspect of it, minimizing the impact of the soil in terms of disturbance, better rotations of crops, cover cropping where it makes sense to do so. It doesn't make sense in every soil type, and also more integrating animals into the arable rotation. And this is where the mixed farming element comes into play. There is within this context as well a greater focus on how farming can monetize carbon that is being sequestered. There is a wide range of figures that tend to get quoted in the amount of CO2 that soil can sequester each year, anywhere between 1 and 9 tons. In the grassland context, seems to be more between 1 and 3 tons, with an average of around about 1.2 tons per hectare per year. However, it does reach a limit, and certainly there is a capacity point beyond which it does not make sense to store any further carbon, but certainly opportunities there to have more sequestration. And there are a range of different prices that are being used at the moment. DEFRA has used a £67 per tonne non-traded shadow price of carbon in the past. So remains to be seen in terms of what will emerge in the future as a price for carbon within the farming context. The policies at play at the moment in terms of the sustainable farming incentive don't tend to go down that route. It's more still income foregone plus cost type of approach, and taking some guidance from the countryside stewardship schemes of the past. So within all of that, and looking at it from a farming point of view, how do you monetize all of the carbon opportunities or market opportunities at the minute? There is relatively little scope to do it at present. There are issues that the buyers of CO2 credits also need to overlook as well, and they link to those 3 key challenges that I've mentioned earlier on. In terms of Arla, it is promoting actions that help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but as I said, it is not paying it on the basis of the CO2 equivalent being sequestered. And future schemes, it also seems to be more down the route of promoting actions that help with the greenhouse gas emissions challenge, as opposed to looking at the price of carbon and how much is taken out. So therefore, in terms of the UK farming context, it would not appear to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Focus could very much be on just mitigating CO2, sequestering it where possible, becomes a cost of doing business, so to speak, very much like farm quality assurance schemes at the moment. And there is an additional challenge here for farming as well. If they're getting paid by businesses, for instance, to offset carbon, then obviously it can't be counted twice. If a farmer is offsetting carbon and that has been sold or given the rights to a business, they cannot then claim, well, actually, my beef production is very low impact because look at all I'm doing on farm in terms of sequestering carbon, which includes those activities which are in conjunction with carbon being sold to other businesses. So are some key issues there. Also a challenge for farming as well, insofar as if it goes down the route of selling off carbon credits, well then how is that going to help the brand image for UK farming, particularly given the challenges beef, dairy, sheep meat has as well in terms of overall CO2 emissions. So again, does farming keep some of that back so that it can help to promote its branding advantage for UK farming more generally? So you may be thinking on the call here this morning, well, okay, that's all well and good. What does it actually mean for me as a business supplying products into the UK? But what we can say at the moment, you know, it is very much of a early stage market at the minute, and a wild west, so to speak, for UK farming. And what needs to be done on this is landowners need to be creating carbon reductions that are additional, verifiable as well, to ensure that no double counting is taking place. Certainly forestry and forestry related equipment is leading the way at the moment in terms of opportunities, and will do so in terms of the additional planting of trees and woodlands that is going to take place in the years ahead. But certainly given the sustainable farming incentive, there is a hedgerow standard in place. There will be more maintenance, active maintenance required of that in the future. That might present an opportunity for some, and also energy crops again might help in some particular areas. And for farming more generally, in terms of capturing, potentially selling some carbon, yes, regenerative agriculture can present some opportunities around minimum tillage, no-till equipment where it is appropriate to do so, and certainly mixed farming and re-equipping certain farms for livestock, you know, whether that's handling equipment, whether it's fencing, and whether it's additional sensors and equipment such as that will be needed in the future. That is a trend that we've seen certainly going back a few years. East Anglia, for instance, more livestock farming being reintroduced there. And certainly some companies have been taking advantage of that as well. But there's also a need to be focused on productivity, getting more out of grazed grass in particular, and that also helps reducing feed usage, particularly around soya, which is a big challenge in some sectors. And of course, all of this is needed to measure and manage more accurately. As the adage goes, you can't measure it, you can't manage it effectively, let alone mitigate it, and let alone market yourself as being a low carbon farmer or a low carbon supplier of goods into the farming industry. So that then moves us on to some food industry initiatives, which also need to be considered. And here we're just giving a flavour in terms of some leading retailers that are active in the UK, where they're at in terms of net zero. And you can see the targets very much by 2040, several of them. Tesco, for instance, looking to go earlier than that, Aldi somewhat later, aligned with the UK government's targets. And you can see as well some of the key initiatives that are being promoted in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly reductions by 2030 is a key focus that a number of them are looking at. However, you can see also, you know, it's looking at issues around paper, around packaging, and of course every area needs to be looked at in this context. But I think there still needs to be more joining of the dots, so to speak, in terms of getting from where we are now to 2030 and onwards into 2050, in terms of how farming and how retailer supply chains can achieve net zero. But it is becoming more and more of a focus, and that will, from now, it's already having an influence on some farmers, that will have more and more of an impact as we move into the future. And from a processing perspective, and here we're giving a few examples of organisations active in the dairy and beef and sheep meat sectors. Again, the plan's somewhat delayed here, more around 2050. that the net zero targets tend to be focused on. And I think in this context, perhaps arguably the processors that bit closer to the farming sector and, more where the rubber might meet the road, so to speak, in terms of delivering on these plans. Perhaps some might argue they're a bit more realistic in terms of what might be achievable as we move towards 2050 in terms of achieving net zero. But again, a number of more actions will be needed from the processing sector, and I think some more work certainly is needed in terms of what specifically they will do to achieve net zero. Again, more of a focus on packaging usage, for instance, water consumption also getting mentioned in that context. So you can see from that, the retailers, the processors, they don't have all the answers yet, but it certainly is becoming very high on their agenda now, how to go about achieving net zero, because it's important from a consumer and societal perspective as well. And if we come back to the farm level to just look at the state of play at the moment within the UK as a whole, how important greenhouse gas emissions are in decision making, you can certainly see there that there are split in views overall in terms of how important they see it. Certainly within the cereal sector, there is an agreement that reducing greenhouse gas emissions will help the business overall in terms of profitability. But some of the other sectors, most interestingly grazing livestock, they don't tend to agree with that. Over 60% of them don't think it will have an influence on their profitability overall, and similar levels within the pigs and poultry sector. And you can see from that table on your screen the importance level being placed on it. Yes, it is starting to increase more, I would suggest, than if we took this survey a few years back, but I think it's not quite there yet in terms of being a front and center issue. Fairly important, but still not a high importance being placed on it at the moment. And also important just to consider as well, agritech in this context and how precision farming could potentially be used here. Here we've just got some overviews from the DEFRA Farm Practices survey that focuses on England, but just looks at some of the techniques that are used on farm in terms of precision farming and where they're at the moment. And you can certainly see, in the arable sector in particular, yield mapping, soil mapping, variable rate application, that is done quite frequently now, as is more regular measuring of livestock growth rates. But a number of different areas in terms of pasture measurement, heat detection, for instance, the data suggests that there is scope for more to be done on those fronts, and certainly the rates scope to increase them in the future. Focus in terms of agritech, very much on productivity, reducing input costs in particular. Of course, they can help with regards to achieving the net zero challenge, but it doesn't, the environmental impacts don't tend to be mentioned that frequently yet within a farming context. And it's similar as well in terms of the livestock sector. Again, animal health, particularly a core focus. Soil health also getting mentioned as well. But once again, you can see net zero considerations a bit further down in terms of the overall priorities. And that's certainly something that my colleagues at Anderson's are seeing as they advise farms on a daily basis as well. The focus very much on short-term profitability within an English context in particular, but elsewhere as well, how to mitigate those BPS losses because from around about from 24 onwards, no matter if you're a small farm, more than half of your BPS payment is going to be phased out. And by 2028, the BPS payment will be lost altogether and replaced by other schemes, which won't be as profitable because you'll be expected to do more before you receive any support payments. So at the moment, the focus of net zero, it is very much retailer processor led, but they need to get more information, better plans together in terms of joining all the dots to get us from where we are now to a net zero situation in the future. Dairying seems to be a bit further ahead on this front than in other sectors, particularly if we look at livestock, grazing livestock and the arable sector. Pigs and poultry, not so much talk in that sector at the moment, because of course they are particularly reliant on soya from South America, which has a strong carbon footprint associated with it. So in terms of the actions that farmers are looking at, again, much more of a focus on cost and productivity. We're seeing regenerative farming getting mentioned more and more, and certainly more livestock coming into the rotation is a trend to be aware of. Dairying focus very much on optimizing output from grass so they can replace feed. Fertilizer efficiency gets mentioned a lot in that context. We're also seeing sex semen becoming more of a focus as well, and genetics, both within dairying and within grazing livestock, set to play more of a role, particularly for those strains that can help in terms of producing low methane cattle in the future. Intensive livestock, as I said, not as far on with in this context. Some focus on insect protein, alternative proteins, but that is taking quite a bit of time to come to fruition. Poultry sector focusing a lot on its better chicken commitment, but there is a dilemma there in terms of if you have lower stocking rates for birds, for instance, taking them longer to reach maturity, they're consuming more feed. So whilst the animal welfare might be higher, actually the carbon emitted increases as well. So a challenge for that sector in order to achieve that balance between both greenhouse gas emissions and better animal welfare. And woodland, as I've alluded to, it is taking place, investment, it is increasing on farms, but usually needs funding or support from elsewhere, whether it's a business in some contexts or whether it's support schemes. And there's a new woodland grant scheme just being announced in Northern Ireland just in the last day or so. So in terms of overall opportunities from net zero, where to focus on. If we look at the UK more generally, there's 6 key opportunity areas that get mentioned. Certainly carbon storage, woodland, hedgerows, seaweed farming also gets mentioned as well in this context, is an area that it's focusing on. And that, particularly around seaweed, linked with novel production systems, which also includes, of course, vertical farming initiatives as well. Particular focus for high value crops. James Hutton Institute in Scotland, quite active in this area. But productivity, very much a key focus as well. And here, focusing on doing more with less, and Centre for Innovation and Excellence in Livestock, it's brought out a report at the end of last year which identified 8 key opportunity areas for livestock farming in the context of achieving net zero. And again, you can see a strong productivity scheme based on the graphic on the right-hand side of your screen is evident there, but also just looking at novel types of feed. And here, seaweed does get mentioned. It can help in some contexts, but I think important to bear in mind as well that often the suitable seaweed varieties can be based in Asia Pacific. So the logistics around that can be a challenge. Could be opportunities there for Ireland as well, given its vast sea territory, and certainly know a lot of research is ongoing on that front. Nitrogen use again and again gets mentioned in this context. So optimizing fertilizer usage, applying lime, which can present opportunities for some where possible, and of course alternative legume species as well that can help to fix nitrogen on the land is a key focus. And as you can see elsewhere, smart technology is getting mentioned quite a lot, and also just improving the whole measurement and management, which again will be a challenge as well as an opportunity for businesses in this sector to show that the impact that they're having with their products and solutions on reducing greenhouse gas emissions is verifiable and is shown to have a difference. Few other opportunity areas that get mentioned, particularly around the renewables, bioeconomy. Certainly farming can do a lot in that regard. And also evidence of some more novel initiatives around using CO2 in conjunction with hydrogen to generate protein, which in turn can be used for feed, particularly within the intensive livestock sector, within the fish sector as well. So perhaps more innovation needed there. And using waste, valorization of waste as they call it, how waste can be turned into products that can help in terms of inputs into farming. Again, another area that gets mentioned. There might be opportunities here as well to work with other industrial sectors to utilize products coming from them within the farming sector. As I've mentioned, carbon credits, certainly a key focus area, and important, I think, for Irish SMEs, any solutions you put forward, ensuring that you can verify what impact they will have on the overall carbon footprint. That brings us on into some grant opportunities. I thought it might be useful for you to be aware of here this morning. There are several ones of relevance to the SMEs. Would include the Transforming Food Production initiative. This makes 90 million available over 4 years from Innovate UK. Very much a partnerships driven approach and a data driven approach towards net zero. There isn't a funding program opened at the moment, but as I understand it, other funding programs will become available. So certainly worth keeping an eye on that. Innovate UK Smart Grants, 25 million being made available. There is a program open at this point in time. Focus here very much on game-changing technologies and commercially viable solutions that will help the UK economy more generally, but certainly worth considering an application there, particularly for those organisations that have bases within the UK. And worth pointing out the HMRC R&D tax relief within this sector as well. Some good incentives there for firms to be able to offset some of their R&D spending on the tax that they would pay. Focus particularly on new improved products, and again, waste valorization, new production lines, and better and more efficient systems all potentially qualify. So again, worth looking at that. And from a farming perspective more generally, in terms of agricultural policy, there are a range of other support schemes that we're awaiting details on, including the Farming Investment Fund. So that's like the son of the Countryside Productivity Scheme that has been in place for farm equipment in recent years. That is due to open up in the autumn. There'll be 2 different tiers of support available, so certainly worth keeping your eyes out on that. A range of other schemes, some of them focus on training and improving resilience, others focusing on issues such as slurry management. And here there will be a capital grant for storage of 6 months and over. We believe that will become available in next year, and hopefully some more detail on that towards the end of the year. Animal welfare also gets focused on as well. Again, though, improvements above and beyond the regulatory baseline from 2022. And new entrants here, very much a focus on actual programs as opposed to being just a new entrant for the sake of it. That might present some opportunities in terms of offering products to those stakeholders for Irish SMEs and for the net zero products that you might be offering in the future. So that brings us just to some summary and conclusions before we open up for Q&A. I think in terms of net zero, Brexit obviously and COVID of course as well have dominated the discussions in recent years. But as the effects of those hopefully begin to dissipate, you'll see net zero more and more becoming front and center. In terms of the climate, but also in terms of society as well, it is demanding that every sector will play its part in the years ahead. And there are particular challenges there for agriculture that it needs to address. ELM is there more in the background supporting actions to help with greenhouse gas emissions. Some of those actions might create opportunities for firms supplying products into the UK agricultural sector. And I think though the key message I would have certainly this morning is, you know, products that you would offer, they cannot really just focus on net zero alone. You're going to convince farmers you need something additional, whether it's optimizing productivity, you know, better yields, lower input usage, or helping with labour as well, which is becoming a key problem with the ending of free movement. There are certainly key points, key buttons that need to be pressed in any value proposition to the UK market. And there are opportunities emerging as well, as I've alluded to, in genetics, slurry management, particularly around ammonia. We see some projects being established now, just looking at micro scale anaerobic digestion plants. Certainly could be something within the dairy sector that would have promise. Building design also needs to be looked at. There are questions around what could be done in terms of methane capture when cattle are inside for 6 months of the year in some cases. Again, things that are worth looking at. And around farm machinery, very much optimizing inputs usage is a key focus. Automation becoming increasingly important, as is robotics as well. And because of soil health being a key theme in this context, reducing farm machinery's impact on the soil, I think, will be an important consideration as we move in the future, particularly given the sustainable farming incentive has 2 soils related standards in terms of arable and grassland soils. So within the UK, we're very much in the period now of an accelerated change that's taking place. Agricultural policy being reformed, trade policy, new trade deal with Australia being mentioned previous or recently as well. And that is going to create competitive pressure on farming. And certainly the research that we've done suggests that the number of actual farm businesses, so these are decision-making units as opposed to farm holdings, round about 54,000 of those in the UK at present. By 2030, that could be down to around about 42,000 farm businesses overall. So significant reduction there. But I think the important point to make here is farm output is not necessarily going to change in the same magnitude. It is unlikely to change massively in that period. You'll get fewer farmers doing more, basically, as has been the case within the dairy sector in particular over recent years. And I think the challenge for SMEs and for the dealerships that you might be dealing with is to align yourself with the winners from that process. So that concludes the questions or the points from me. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And we'll now open up the discussion to some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. That's a very comprehensive overview, and to do so in 45 minutes is no easy task. So thank you very much for that. We now have just over 10 minutes for questions and answers. So again, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat or questions tab on GoToWebinar. I can see a couple coming in already. Michael, the first question I might ask you, so DEFRA recently released further details of its sustainable farming incentive, that pilot that you just mentioned a couple of slides ago. And they've released details including payment rates and standards farmers will have to adhere to. To what extent do you think this scheme will help to drive farmers towards net zero?
Yeah, I think there, you know, it will be a starting point, but very much just that in terms of the sustainable farming incentive. Payment rates, they're based on the previous countryside stewardship scheme of the past. And the analysis that we've certainly done on that using our model farms is when you take into consideration the requirements for land, for instance, to be taken out of production to improve biodiversity, the income foregone from that is quite significant and the payment rates are quite low overall. So in a number of standards, doesn't really stack up. Hedgerow standard is actually one of those standards where the payment rates are quite good. So for that reason, we think it could present opportunities there. So it might get farmers thinking along the lines of net zero, but it's not going to move the dial in terms of getting farmers to take actions. I think that's going to come from elsewhere.
Okay. Like, are there any additional areas that UK farmers are likely to be focusing on to help them and the UK more generally to achieve net zero? Is there anything else that we should have on our radar that we should be conscious of?
Yeah, I think in that context, renewables rightly does get mentioned, and it's certainly a key area that can be focused on. A lot of roof space, for instance, on farms, opportunities there for solar power, rainwater harvesting as well in a more wider environmental context. But I think in addition to that, and particularly given where farms are located in relation to the electricity grid, it takes a lot more energy to supply farms in more remote areas than in large urban centres. So therefore, the whole area around power storage, I think, is something that needs to be given some consideration. If the wind is blowing, if there's a lot of sunshine, times of the day where farms can actually store energy, that could be done on farm and then released. If there's milking taking place in the morning or evening time, to help with that, I think that would help overall. And then any excess energy that might be generated on a consistent basis, getting that distributed into the grid more locally, I think would help as well. And certainly an area that the farming industry, should consider, and opportunities there. The industry is going to need to look at every aspect of operations, as is the economy generally. And that's an example of an area that might benefit from some more focus.
Okay. I think, Michael, you mentioned in your presentation as well the role of woodland and peat as well for offsetting. A very basic question perhaps, but is tree planting ultimately the main answer here, do you think?
It's certainly going to help in terms of locking away carbon, sequestering carbon for a significant period of time. However, I don't necessarily think it's the the panacea that some make it out to be, because at the end of the day, a tree, once it reaches the end of its life, if you're really going to permanently take that carbon out, you really need to put it down a mine shaft or something to really lock away the carbon. Otherwise, if it gets burned or if it starts to rot, then that carbon is released again. So I'd be somewhat cautious around that. It is a part of the solution, but should not be seen as the silver bullet that will address everything. And we sit here in 2021 now. It might be difficult to see a future, beyond where some of this climate or all of this climate change challenge could be addressed. But if you get breakthrough innovations elsewhere, electric powered aviation, for instance, the net zero could become a lot closer. And we do need to consider the unintended consequences if you put large swathes of farmland into woodland. As global populations trend towards 10 billion by 2050, it's a lot of extra mouths to feed, a lot higher global middle class by that stage as well. So it will be important not to take productive land out of farming for that reason alone. So perhaps the focus, if woodland is going to be used, needs to be on those least productive areas of land. Maybe use a precision farming approach in that front, but certainly not plant large swathes of farmland into forestry. That would be our view, at least.
Yeah. We've got a question coming in on the questions tab here. Another one. So the slide on percentage uptake of technology was based on percentage of farms. Given the wide variety of farms and estate sizes in the UK, do you have a view, or do you have line of sight on the percentage of land use analysis? So rather than the percentage of farms, do you have a view on the percentage of land use in terms of uptake of technology?
Yeah, I think certainly on that, there will be those larger farming operations and those engaged in contract farming, which will be operating very large arees of land. The uptake of technology is certainly more prevalent there, so certainly think it's a fair comment. If you look at area of land that is utilising technology, it would be higher than the percentage of farms listed. I think that is a fair comment to make. We haven't seen, or we haven't done any studies specifically on that point to say what percentage it would be. It certainly would be higher though, and linking with the point of aligning with some winners in the future, they potentially are the ones more likely to expand more in the future, particularly as farmland might become available elsewhere. BPS being lost, with the lump sum retirement scheme that's also being proposed by DEFRA to get some of those older, arguably less productive farmers ceasing activity of farming, and that land being released to those bigger operations more likely to use technology.
Okay. Michael, do you think companies working in the agri supply chain should be looking at their own sustainability and decarbonisation strategies? Do you think this will become a procurement factor for the UK agri industry? Will it be something that they'll be looking for? Will they be looking for their supply chain partners, their machinery providers, whoever it might be, to actually have their own sustainability strategies in place? Is that alignment with industry? Is that important?
Yes, I think that's going to become increasingly important in the future. You know, we're seeing announcements now. If you look at retailers, what they want to do in terms of CO2 emissions in the future, looking at their operations, looking at their whole supply chain as well in that context. So being able to demonstrate in terms of what individual firms are doing, including the inputs supplied into farming, I think that's going to be important. And what you're going to see, in my view, would be, you know, the concept of a value chain gets mentioned a lot within business more generally. You know, a type of carbon value chain, so to speak, that whatever is being done on the inputs level, you know, that in turn can have a benefit into the farm level, onwards into the processor and into the retailer. And it's going to require reductions in every stage in that process to achieve net zero. So I think anything that manufacturers can do to verify their carbon footprint and their plans for reducing carbon, I think that will help certainly in gaining traction in the UK in the years ahead.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that in your presentation, that it's crucial to quantify that, and how using Irish solutions and engaging with Irish SMEs can lower the farm level carbon footprint, which I think is a very important point, and probably feeds into the necessity to build that sustainability criteria into your sales and marketing strategies as well. And I think, again, that comes back to the point of aligning with the priorities of retailers or processors or dealers that you might be engaging with. Michael, I might just ask you quickly, and just conscious slightly of the time, you touched on the HMRC R&D tax relief well in your presentation. Do you think it's important for Irish companies in the UK to communicate or to make their potential customers aware of that support? Will that help incentivize, do you think, potentially potential customers in the UK to adopt Irish technology? Is that important for Irish companies to communicate to their customer base?
Yes, I think any opportunity in terms of, you know, how to help with profitability, in addition to net zero carbon footprint as well, I think just needs to be taken advantage of, really, as you know, you're offering products and solutions within the UK market. You know, within the UK, there's, you know, many different stakeholders involved, and I think anything that can be done to inform farmers or people dealing with farms in terms of what's available and what can be potentially deployed to help them, I think always helps to gain traction among a customer base, whether it's England, Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland.
Absolutely. As I said, I'm conscious of the time. I think we're just at the hour mark. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join the briefing this morning. I'd also like to thank Michael again for his time and input. A recording of today's session along with presentation slides will be made available via email to all attendees shortly, and is also going to be shared across our Enterprise Ireland communication also. Please do feel free to share with any relevant colleagues or contacts. Please do also keep an eye out for further EI UK net zero sector insights, including events and reports that will hopefully help to keep you up to speed with the pace of change here in the UK, and hopefully help you to understand the implications for your business. If you want further information, market assistance, or have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly. The details are on the screen now. Other than that, the only thing left to say is to thank you again for taking the time to join this morning's session. Have a good day and hope to speak to you again, hopefully in person the next time. Thanks everyone. Thanks Michael.
Thank you, Dara. Thanks everyone for your time today. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.